March 1993, a meteorological bomb detonated over the East Coast, burying 26 states, claiming hundreds of lives, and reminding a modern superpower that nature still holds the ultimate veto. The Big Silence is a retrospective journey into the storm of the century, a cyclonic event of biblical proportions that struck in March 1993. Stretching from the jungles of Central America to the woods of Maine, this wasn't just a blizzard, it was a hurricane wrapped in snow. Through archival news footage, home video diaries, and survivor interviews, we explore the 3 days when the interstate highway system vanished, the power grid failed, and millions of Americans were forced to pause. It is a story of tragedy, with 270 lives lost, but also of resilience, capturing the last great shared weather event before the digital age fragmented our collective attention. If you close your eyes and think back to the early spring of 1993, you might remember the sound, or rather, the lack of it. For 3 days in March, the hum of the American East Coast, the engines of commerce, the roar of the interstates, the chatter of the suburbs, was smothered under a blanket of white so heavy it felt like the sky itself had collapsed. They called it the storm of the century, and for once, the hyperbole wasn't just headline-grabbing, it was an understatement. This wasn't your average nor'easter. This was a monster that defied geography. It dropped snow on the beaches of the Florida Panhandle and hurricane-force winds on the skyscrapers of Manhattan. It buried single-story homes in the Smoky Mountains and paralyzed every major airport from Atlanta to Montreal. When the barometer bottomed out on March 13th, the atmosphere literally exploded. Thunder snow, lightning flashing through a whiteout, shook houses from Birmingham to Boston. But beneath the cozy nostalgia of snow days and hot cocoa lies a darker reality. This storm was a killer. 270 people didn't make it to the thaw. They died in snowdrifts, they died at sea, and they died in freezing homes when the grid gave up the ghost. This is the story of the White Hurricane, the story of the weekend America froze. If you were there, you remember the silence. That is the paradox of March 1993. We call it the Storm of the Century, a title that sounds loud, violent, and chaotic. And it was. It was a meteorological bomb that detonated over the eastern third of the United States. For 3 days, the great American machine simply stopped. The interstate highway system, the arteries of our commerce, vanished. The power grid, dark. The constant hum of the suburbs was replaced by a heavy, muffling blanket of white. It's hard to explain to a generation raised on iPhones and real-time radar apps just how vulnerable we were. In 1993, the internet was a curiosity, not a utility. We didn't have Twitter to tell us the plow was coming. We had the radio, we had landlines that were slowly going dead, and we had the blue glow of the Weather Channel, until that flickered out too. This wasn't just a blizzard, it was a white hurricane. A freak convergence of atmospheric violence that dropped snow on the beaches of the Gulf of Mexico and sent storm surges crashing into Long Island. It affected 26 states and touched the lives of half the U.S. population. But beneath the cozy nostalgia of snow days and neighbors helping neighbors, there is a grim tally. 270 people died that weekend. They died in snowdrifts, they died at sea, and they died in freezing living rooms. To understand the sheer mechanics of this disaster, you have to look at the map of North America like a chessboard. Usually the pieces move in predictable patterns. Cold air stays up in Canada, warm air stays down in the Caribbean. They might spar a little in the middle, give us a rainy Tuesday in Tennessee, and move on. But in early March 1993, the board was being set for a checkmate. First, you had the Arctic high, a dome of brutally cold air plunging down from the spine of the Rockies, chilling the ground, waiting. Second, a low-pressure system was churning over Texas, eager to move east. And third, the kicker, a powerful surge of the subtropical jet stream pumping unlimited moisture straight up from the tropics. You have to appreciate where we were technologically. In 1993, weather forecasting was still part science, part gut instinct. We didn't have the high-resolution, hour-by-hour modeling we have today. But 5 days out, an eternity in weather terms, the primitive supercomputers were screaming. They were predicting a barometric pressure drop so severe, so rapid, that it resembled a Category 3 hurricane. The meteorologists stared at the screens in disbelief. They ran the models again and again. The result was the same. This wasn't just a nor'easter. This was an atmospheric bomb. On Friday, March 12th, the low-pressure system deepened explosively over the warm waters of the Gulf. The energy release was catastrophic. It began not with snow, but with a gale in the Gulf of Mexico that caught oil rigs and cargo ships completely off guard. The beast had been born, and it was hungry. It turned its eye toward the Florida Panhandle and the Deep South, places where snow shovels are sold as novelty items, if they're sold at all. The ingredients were mixed. The fuse was lit. The storm was no longer a prediction. It was a physical reality, barreling north at 40 miles an hour. Beat 3, the rise. Urgent, descriptive. The storytelling shifts from the meteorological maps to the ground level. A tone of awe mixed with dread. The storm didn't knock on the door, it kicked it in. It made landfall in Florida just after midnight, leading with a terrifying sucker punch. Before a single snowflake fell, a line of tornadoes and a massive storm surge ripped through the Panhandle and the Gulf Coast. We're talking about hurricane-force winds in March. Houses were swept off foundations in chaotic darkness. People woke up thinking they were in the middle of Andrew, not a winter storm. Birmingham, Alabama, a city of steel mills and humidity, was buried under 17 inches of snow. It was surreal. Palm trees were snapping under the weight of ice. The mighty pine forests of Georgia, trees that bend in the wind but break under weight, sounded like gunfire as millions of limbs shattered, taking the power lines down with them. On I-75 and I-10, traffic ground to a halt. We saw 18-wheelers jackknifed across 3 lanes, creating parking lots that stretched for miles. Families returning from spring break in Florida, wearing shorts and t-shirts, found themselves trapped in unheated station wagons as the mercury dropped into the single digits. They were stranded in a whiteout in places where they didn't even sell ice scrapers at the gas stations. And up in the Great Smoky Mountains, the trap was even deadlier. Hundreds of hikers and campers had gone into the Appalachians for a weekend getaway. They were expecting a crisp, early spring chill. Instead, they were hit with a blizzard that defied logic. Snowdrifts piled up to 5 feet. Search and rescue teams couldn't launch helicopters. The wind shear was too violent. These hikers weren't just lost. They were being erased from the landscape. In Washington, D.C., the government didn't just close, it vanished. The monuments, the Lincoln, the Jefferson, were scrubbed from the skyline by a wall of white. But the real show, the main event, was happening in the canyons of New York City. You have to remember the energy of New York in the early 90s. It was loud, it was gritty, it was unstoppable. But on March 13th, the city that never sleeps was put into a medically induced coma. The snow wasn't drifting down, it was being fired horizontally. We witnessed a phenomenon that until then, most Americans thought was a myth: thundersnow. The sky would turn a bruised, electric purple, followed by the crack of thunder, all while snow fell at 4-5 inches an hour. It felt biblical. It felt like the sky was confused. For those of us inside, looking out through frosted apartment windows, there was a strange, hypnotic beauty to it. The roar of the traffic was replaced by the roar of the wind, and when the wind died down for a brief second, silence. A heavy, muffled, impossible silence. We were witnessing the peak of the storm's power, a superstorm stretching from Cuba to Canada, spinning like a buzzsaw, dumped the equivalent of 40 days of flow from the Mississippi River onto the East Coast in the form of snow. It was terrifying, yes, but looking back, it was magnificent. To understand the weight of this storm, you have to understand the era it fell upon. 1993 sits in this unique pocket of American history. It was the twilight of the analog age. We didn't have smartphones to doom scroll through the blizzard. We didn't have Wi-Fi, streaming services, or Zoom. When the roads closed in '93, the world didn't just move online. It stopped. It actually stopped. But for those who kept power, we huddled around a different kind of campfire. This was the moment cable television truly proved its worth. Specifically, the Weather Channel. Before the internet was in every pocket, the Weather Channel was the oracle. We sat on shag carpets and floral sofas, glued to those blue and orange radar maps, mesmerized by the local on the 8s. It became a shared national experience. Whether you were in a high-rise in Philly or a farmhouse in Alabama, you were watching the same meteorologists break down the same isobar lines. It created a strange intimacy. We were all in the bunker together. And outside, the social contract shifted. Because we couldn't work from home, the snow day was absolute. It was a pardon from responsibility. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years were suddenly sharing shovels and rock salt. You saw teenagers walking to the local video store, hoping it was open, hoping to rent a couple of VHS tapes to ride out the night. There was a resilience to it, sure, but also a fragility we didn't want to admit. We were riding the high of the post-Cold War era, an economic upswing, feeling invincible. But this storm exposed how thin the veneer really was. Our entire modern life depended on a grid built decades prior, and Mother Nature was currently burying that grid under 4 feet of concrete heavy snow. This is the moment the narrative changed. Sometime around the early hours of March 13th, the novelty of the snow day was shredded by 70-mile-per-hour winds. What meteorologists saw on their instruments that morning didn't look like a winter storm. It looked like a heart attack on the barometric charts. The pressure dropped so low, so fast, that if you were looking at the satellite imagery, it resembled a Category 3 hurricane, a hurricane with a core of ice. This is where the storm of the century earned its name. It wasn't just the depth of the snow, it was the geography of the chaos. Usually a nor'easter stays in its lane. It hits New England, maybe clips the mid-Atlantic. But this monster had a wingspan that defied logic. It was snowing on the beaches of the Florida Panhandle. It was burying Birmingham, Alabama, under a foot of powder. These were places that didn't own snowplows. They didn't have salt trucks. They didn't have the infrastructure to handle 2 inches, let alone 12. The interstate system, the vascular system of the American economy, began to suffer cardiac arrest. I-75, I-95, I-81, they didn't just slow down, they became parking lots of ice. Thousands of motorists, truck drivers, and families on spring break were trapped in their vehicles. And as the gas tanks ran dry, the heat went out. That cozy isolation we felt in our living rooms, it was curdling into genuine fear. The radio wasn't playing soft rock anymore. It was broadcasting emergency shelter locations that nobody could reach. The storm had stopped being a weather event. It had become a siege. It started with the sound that haunts anyone who's lived through a serious ice storm. The gunshot crack of an old oak tree giving way, followed by the electric blue explosion of a transformer blowing out. Then the hum of the refrigerator stopped. The furnace clicked off. This was the tipping point. This is where the blizzard of '93 stopped being a weather event and became a humanitarian crisis. In 1993, we didn't have the digital tethers we have today. When the power died, the television died. There were no smartphones to check radar maps or text neighbors. If your landline went down, and millions did, you weren't just in the dark, you were alone. You were cut off from the world in a way that is almost impossible to imagine in the 21st century. As night fell, the cold began to invade. It crept through the window panes and under the door jambs. The temperature inside the average suburban home began to chase the temperature outside. People put on their coats in their living rooms. They gathered in the smallest room of the house, huddling under piles of quilts, watching their breath plume in the flashlight beam. But the cold makes people desperate, and desperation leads to mistakes. This is the tragic arithmetic of the storm. A significant number of those 270 fatalities didn't die from the wind or the snow. They died trying to stay warm. In living rooms from Alabama to Maine, people brought charcoal grills inside. They opened oven doors and turned up the gas. They ran portable generators in attached garages. While the wind howled outside, a silent, odorless killer, carbon monoxide, began to fill the lungs of families trying to survive the night. It was a cruel irony. The very things they used to sustain life ended up taking it. And for the elderly, trapped in rural farmhouses or urban walk-ups, the isolation was absolute. The snow was piled so high against the doors, they literally couldn't push them open. They were prisoners in their own homes, waiting for a thaw that was days away, while the mercury continued to drop. If Saturday night was the apocalypse, Sunday, March 14th, was the revelation. The clouds broke and the sun came out with a blinding, diamond-hard brilliance against the snow. And that's when we finally saw the true scale of what had happened. We opened our front doors and found walls of white packing the frames like styrofoam. In the Smoky Mountains, drifts reached the second-story windows. In Birmingham, Alabama, a city that shuts down for an inch of slush, they were staring at over a foot of powder. The interstate system was gone, erased from the map, replaced by a seamless white ribbon stretching from Florida to Maine. But this is where the character of the country revealed itself. We didn't wait for FEMA. In 1993, the cavalry was your neighbor with a four-wheel drive. This was the moment of the big dig. It was a physical, analog struggle. There were no drones to survey the damage. We did it with backs, sweat, and millions of gallons of diesel. Across the Appalachians, a volunteer navy of snowmobiles and modified jeeps mobilized. They called them the Mosquito Fleet. These were guys who had spent years tinkering with their trucks and garages, waiting for a moment just like this. They ferried doctors to hospitals. They ran insulin to diabetics trapped in hollers. They smashed through 4-foot drifts to deliver kerosene to the elderly. Up in the air, the National Guard began one of the largest peacetime rescue missions in history. The iconic image of the aftermath isn't just the buried cars. It's the Huey helicopters hovering over white pastures, dropping bales of hay to starving cattle that were chest-deep in snow. It was a military operation, but the enemy was the landscape itself. And down on the suburban streets, a strange thing happened. The fences that usually separated us disappeared under the drifts. You couldn't tell where your yard ended and the neighbors began, so people stopped caring. We shoveled each other's driveways. We shared coffee from thermoses. For about 48 hours, the rigid social barriers of the 90s melted away. We were all just survivors in parkas, leaning on our shovels, blinking in the sun, marveling at the mountains we had to move. We were cold, we were sore, and we were exhausted. But we were out of the dark. If the cleanup proved our resilience, the coverage proved something else entirely: our addiction to the spectacle. Before March 1993, weather was largely a local affair. You had your guy in a cheap suit pointing at a magnetic map on Channel 7, telling you to wear galoshes. But the storm of the century changed the physics of television. It was the moment meteorology graduated from small talk to primetime drama. This was the moon landing moment for the Weather Channel. Before the blizzard, TWC was background noise, something you left on while vacuuming. But as that white monster crawled up the spine of the Appalachians, they were the only ones broadcasting the apocalypse in real time. We watched the radar loops like they were playoff games. We saw the reporters standing sideways in gale force winds, inventing a new genre of performance art, the windshield wiper stand-up. This storm taught the networks that fear was a commodity. It birthed the superstorm branding we see today. Before 93, a snowstorm was an inconvenience. After 93, every low-pressure system became a potential event with its own logo and theme music. We lost the innocence of simply looking out the window. We replaced it with the anxiety of the cone of uncertainty. But the legacy wasn't just on the screen. It was in the maternity wards. You can't lock millions of Americans in their houses with no electricity, no heat, and nothing to do for 3 days without consequences. 9 months later, in December of 1993, hospitals from Birmingham to Boston reported a statistically significant spike in birth rates. They called them blizzard babies. It's a funny footnote, but it speaks to something deeper. For a few days, the relentless hustle of the American 90s, the pager culture, the commute, the grind, stopped cold. We were forced to slow down. We were forced to huddle together for warmth. In a decade that was sprinting toward the digital future, this was one last massive pause button pressed by Mother Nature. The storm left a physical scar on the landscape, sure, but its real legacy was psychological. It taught us that no matter how many satellites we launched or how many interstates we paved, the atmosphere could still shut down the greatest superpower on Earth with a single breath. Walk into a hardware store in March today, and the difference is staggering. In '93, we fought back with rock salt and aluminum shovels. Today, we have two-stage gas-powered snowblowers with heated handles and headlights. We have municipal trucks spraying liquid magnesium chloride brines on the interstate 3 days before a flake even hits the asphalt. Technologically, we are light years ahead. The forecast models that predicted the '93 storm were running on supercomputers with less processing power than the smartphone in your pocket. Today, we don't just know a storm is coming, we know the barometric pressure drop down to the decimal point 10 days out. The surprise is gone. The mystery has been replaced by the push notification. But in our rush to conquer the winter, we lost something sacred. We killed the snow day. Think back. In 1993, the cancellation of school was a high-stakes lottery. You sat cross-legged on the carpet, staring at the bottom of the TV screen, waiting for your county's name to scroll by in that alphabetical parade of liberation. When it hit, when you saw closed, it was pure, unadulterated joy. It was a pardon from the governor. Today, the infrastructure of the internet has made the physical world optional. When the roads ice over now, the emails don't stop. The Zoom calls don't get rescheduled. Schools have swapped sledding hills for remote learning days. We have built a world where commerce and productivity are immune to the elements. We've weatherproofed the economy, but we've exposed the soul. In '93, the storm forced us to disconnect from the system and connect with our neighbors. If your car was buried, you didn't call an Uber. You knocked on the door 3 houses down because you knew that guy had a winch. Now we sit in our temperature-controlled bubbles, doom-scrolling photos of the drifts on Instagram, tracking the plow trucks on a GPS map. We are safer, undeniably. The death toll of a storm like '93 would likely be lower today simply because medicine and rescue tech have advanced. But we are also more isolated. The shared struggle is gone, replaced by individual inconvenience. We traded the shovel for the salt truck and the candlelight for the LED screen. We conquered the blizzard, sure, but looking at the empty streets of a modern snowstorm, where everyone is home but no one is really present, you have to wonder if we actually won. In America, we have a complicated relationship with control. We are a nation of manifest destiny, of interstate highway systems carved through mountains, of rivers dammed and redirected to power our cities. We operate under the tacit assumption that we have tamed the continent. We believe that if we just pour enough concrete and write enough code, we can insulate ourselves from the wild. The blizzard of '93 was the check on that hubris. It was the great humbler. For 3 days in March, a storm the size of a continent looked at our schedules, our quarterly earnings, our flight plans, and our urgency, and it simply said, no. It's rare for a single event to touch 26 states simultaneously. Usually a disaster is local, a hurricane in Florida, a tornado in Kansas, a flood in the Midwest. But the superstorm was ubiquitous. It created a shared, simultaneous experience for half the population of the United States. From the palm trees of Birmingham, Alabama, buried under a foot of powder, to the pine forests of Maine, we were all freezing together. There is something profound in that synchronization. In a culture that celebrates individualism, my car, my house, my career, the storm stripped away the hierarchy. The snow didn't care what tax bracket you were in. A Mercedes gets stuck in a 4-foot drift just as fast as a beat-up Ford sedan. When the power lines snapped under the weight of the ice, the heat went out in the executive mansion and the studio apartment all the same. We were reminded violently of our own fragility. We tend to forget that civilization is just a thin veneer over the natural world. It takes electricity to keep the pumps running, gas to keep the trucks moving, and clear roads to keep the food on the shelves. In '93, we saw how quickly that veneer could crack. We saw how thin the line really is between a modern superpower and a cold, dark frontier. But in that vulnerability, there was a strange kind of grace. Because when the machine stops, you have to look up. You have to look at the sky. You have to look at your family, huddled under blankets in the living room, because it's the only warm place left. The storm forced a pause that we never would have taken voluntarily. It was a mandatory Sabbath for a country that never sleeps. It reminded us that we are not the masters of this planet. We are tenants. And every once in a while, the landlord comes by to remind us who actually holds the deed. The sun that broke over the East Coast on Monday, March 15th, was blinding. It bounced off billions of tons of white crystals, illuminating a landscape that looked less like America and more like the moon. And then slowly, the dripping started. The thaw of 1993 was almost as loud as the storm itself. It was the sound of a nation exhaling. It was the scrape of metal shovels on asphalt, the roar of snowblowers finally chewing through the drifts, and the hum of salt trucks reclaiming the interstate. But as the snow turned to slush and the slush ran into the gutters, it revealed what was left behind. We counted the cost, and it was steep. 270 souls didn't make it to the spring. We lost them to the cold, to the heart attacks earned in driveways, to the sheer violence of the wind. They are the somber footnotes in the history books, the empty chairs at the dinner tables that year. We owe it to them to remember that nature is not a toy. In the decades since, we've had other storms. We've had polar vortexes and bomb cyclones. But none have held the same romantic weight in the American memory. Perhaps it's because '93 was one of the last great shared events before the digital age fully took hold. We didn't tweet about the cold. We knocked on our neighbor's door to see if they had firewood. We didn't live stream the whiteout. We sat by the radio listening to the closings, united in the static. When we look back at that weekend in March, we don't just see the hardship. We see the resilience. We see the National Guard dropping hay to starving cattle. We see strangers pushing a sedan out of a ditch on I-95. We see a pause in the relentless forward motion of American life. A few days where the only thing that mattered was staying warm and keeping each other safe. The snow is long gone. The water it became has cycled through the atmosphere 1,000 times since then. But the memory remains frozen in time, perfect and white. It was the weekend the world stopped. It was the time nature reminded us of our smallness, and in doing so, reminded us of our greatness. It was the storm of the century. And if we're lucky, we'll never see its like again.